Welcome everybody to our last webinar of the CLEF workshop. It has been so far a tremendous success. At least we are very happy about it. And today we are looking forward to two more very interesting chats or presentations. We are going to hear from Teha Lee, who will present her work on how households respond to disability shocks. And then we will have Lloyd talking about what is the strategy in terms of self-employment when households face or are considering the birth of the first child. So I'm going to let Teha start with her presentation. It's about 20 minutes. And please, if you have any questions, just type them along as you think of them, so it's easier to sort them out at the end. Thank you.
Right. Okay. So is my screen showing?
Yes, it is. You're good.
Okay, great. Okay, so thank you so much for coming, and thank you everyone for making this opportunity happen. My name is Teha Lee, and I will be talking today about how households respond to disability shocks and how that affects our welfare analysis of social disability insurance. So the motivation for this project started from these two kind of contrasting data patterns that I will be describing more in the coming slides. Is that first, what I observe in my data is that wives increase their working hours quite significantly when husbands are laid off. And then now this makes a lot of sense intuitively if we think about kind of standard added worker effect arguments. Now, in contrast, wives do not increase their labor supply when husbands are hit by a disability shock, even though disability shocks are also quite persistent income shocks for the household. So this seems to be suggestive that not all income shocks are the same, and then it seems to matter whether income shocks are induced due to health shocks or not. So this project kind of answers two big questions, and then I'm really going to be focusing on the role of spousal care in terms of understanding all of this phenomena. So first part, I'm going to be talking about, okay, so how do spousal labor supply responses to these disability shocks, how much are they attenuated due to the fact that spouses have to spend significant time in spousal care? And the second part that I'm going to be talking about is trying to measure the insurance value that social disability insurance provides, and especially I'm going to be focusing in the US context, the Social Security Disability Insurance. So thinking about how the role of caregiving needs affect measuring the welfare value of SSDI relative to the cost. Now, to give you a bit more context, we can think that married households have an additional source of insurance coming from spousal labor supply. But the point that I'm trying to add into discussion is that actually when we think about households being hit by disability shocks, spousal labor supply is greatly reduced due to the fact that spouses have to be making this time allocation choice between leisure, market work, and caregiving. So I'm going to be doing an empirical estimate of how big that magnitude is when we're trying to make a welfare analysis of SSDI. Okay, so to give you a brief overview of how the paper is structured, I'm going to be talking about some empirical patterns, and then this part is mainly using event study framework to show you kind of the long-term responses to these different shocks. Mainly, I'm going to be comparing between disability and layoff shocks. And the second part is going to be a dynamic model of married households where I generate the welfare analysis. Now, given that we only have 20 minutes in this presentation, I'll be giving you a very, very kind of rough description of the kind of key mechanisms of the models in the interest of time. And then I'll be briefly talking about how I estimate it. And then the fourth part, the counterfactual exercise, is where I'm going to be showing you the welfare analysis that I did with my model. Okay, so going on to the empirical patterns. So the data set that I am using for all of my analysis in this project is the health and retirement study. Now this is a biennial panel of Americans of ages 50 and up, and also their spouses. It has very rich information on a variety of variables that are key to this project. And the important part that I am really exploiting here is the fact that I can also observe caregiver usage for each of the respondents. So I can see, okay, if a respondent replies that they are requiring receiving help from someone else in respect to like a certain set of activities, then the HRS asks, okay, who do you receive care from? How many hours per week do you receive care from this person? Do you pay for this person? And then is it paid by your health insurance, et cetera, et cetera. So they have very detailed information about caregiver usage. So this information is really helping me in this project. The other kind of novel aspect in terms of the data is that I can also link the HRS respondents to administrative Social Security data, so I can actually observe their Social Security earnings as well as disability benefit claims behavior. So those two are kind of the data aspects that are that I'm leveraging in this project. Okay, so just to give you a kind of brief definition about what we mean by disability. Disability here, I'm defining it as having a health condition that limits the type or amount of work that a person can do. Now, this can constitute, different types of health conditions such as, arthritis, back pain, cancer, psychological conditions. These all can constitute as being a disability. So in my sample of married men of ages 50 to 64, about 21% can be classified as being disabled, and about 11% can be classified as being moderate, and then 10% as being severely disabled. So the fraction of disabled men in this population is quite significant here. In terms of the caregiver usage, what I find is that about 20% of moderately disabled husbands respond that they receive some care from their wives, and then about 60% of severely disabled husbands receive care from their wives. So we can see that with the severity of the disability, more husbands are receiving some sort of care, and then this primarily comes from the wives. Now, in terms of the social disability insurance that I am analyzing, as I've alluded, I am using the US context, and then the SSDI, the Social Security Disability Insurance, is the largest disability insurance program in the US that I will be analyzing. Now, this program has a lot of similarities with the CPP/QPP disability insurance. So monthly benefit amounts are based on kind of your monotonic earnings history. In 2016, about on average, this was about $1,300 per month. And the way how the award works is that you have to file an application, and then there's going to be SSA officers who are analyzing your application based on kind of medical and vocational considerations. Now, SSDI is becoming a very large program, and then also there has been a lot of financial burden placed on the trust fund up to the point that in 2016, I believe they were almost depleted with the SSDI funds, and then they had to quickly transfer some funds from other accounts in order to prevent that. So in that sense, I think this project is quite timely in terms of trying to analyze, okay, given the cost of SSDI, how valuable is this program to these households, and then how does the caregiving need affect that analysis? All right, so the event study framework is quite standard. Now here I'm going to be analyzing the shock to the husband, and then looking at the labor supply responses of the wives, mainly because husbands can be classified as kind of the main earners in my sample. So if we see the event study specification here, you can see that it is quite standard. And the coefficients that I'm going to be showing you in the coming slide is going to be the delta K. So the delta K is going to be measuring the change in the dependent variables by the onset year of the shock. So I'm going to be tracking from 4 years before the shock has happened up to 5 years after the shock has happened, and then kind of showing you the results. Okay, so let's actually look at the results. So when we first compare layoff shocks versus disability shocks, so the disability shock coefficients are shown as the blue lines, and then the layoff shocks are shown as the pink lines. We can see that for both of these cases, these are quite large decreases in husband's labor supply post onset of these shocks. And then for both of these cases, this is about a 40% decrease relative to the pre-shock mean. So this is quite significant shock for households. Now, if we look at the changes in the wife's weekly hours worked, in response to the husband's layoffs and in response to the husband's disability, we see a rather kind of contrasting pattern that I alluded in the very beginning of this presentation. So if we look at the pink line, so the wife's weekly hours work, changes in the wife's weekly hours worked in response to husband's layoffs, we can see that there is positive increase. So at the year of the onset, wives increase their weekly working hours by about 4 hours, and then this does persist to at least 2 years and then almost 4 years after. Now for disability shocks, we do not see this effect at all. I mean, it's slightly negative, but the coefficients, you can see that the confidence intervals are crossing the zero. So basically we cannot really see any labor supply responses from wives coming from the husband's disability. Okay. Now, if I do the same thing with the wife's weekly hours in caregiving, we can see that at the year post-disability shocks, wife's weekly hours spent in caregiving just increases significantly. We can see that by year 2 or 3, this increases to about 3.5 hours. Now, recall that the added worker effects that we saw for layoff shocks, if we go back one slide, was about 4 hours. So we can see that the magnitude of the added worker effect coming from husband's layoff shock and the magnitude of increase in weekly hours in caregiving is quite similar. So this is, of course, this is not conclusive, but this is somewhat suggestive that there seems to be, caregiving does seem to be an important element that is dampening the capacity of added worker effects that wives can do. Okay, so to summarize kind of this section, disability seems to be associated with significant decrease in husband's earnings, but wives don't seem to be increasing their working hours. So these are all, well, I think these are interesting patterns that really made me start this project, but just based on these patterns, we can't really say much about, welfare analysis of the disability insurance, which brings us to the second part, which is the model. Now, in the interest of time, so I see that I'm at kind of the 12-minute mark. I just made like very, very kind of brief kind of bullet points that really summarizes the key model mechanics without any equations. So I'm very happy to talk more about the details, by email if you have any questions. But basically, just to summarize this model, what it is, it's basically a dynamic model of married households. I'm assuming that married households are unitary households, meaning that this is a single decision-making unit. So think about a married couple entering the economy at age 50, and then each period, the time period is annual, such that it becomes a life cycle model. Let's see. So there are exogenous, in terms of the shocks, each period a couple enters, there's going to be mortality and divorce shocks. Importantly, of course, there has to be, disability shocks and layoff shocks that the husband experiences, and also some wage shocks here. In terms of the choices that these households make, it's curious that they're going to choose based on the shocks that they receive and based on, the state variables. They're going to decide, okay, how much are they going to consume, and then, how much they're going to be saving through the next period. Also, there's going to be decisions about, labor market hours, and then the wives are, in addition to, leisure and labor market decisions, the wives are also going to be deciding, how much they're going to allocate their given time to caregiving for their husband. And finally, there's going to be decisions about, whether to apply for SSDI benefits or not. Now, in terms of how disability shock enters into this model is that it's going to be reducing the husband's offered wages, and also there's going to be a kind of time cost of working. So when you're disabled, you have significantly higher utility from working. Of course, there's going to be kind of important institutional features of SSDI that I build into this model. Retirement period is quite simple. So starting from age 65 and onward, you're just retire, you only consume from your savings and then just receive retirement benefits. So the retirement period is rather standard, and that's not the important part or the interesting part of this model. The interesting part is going to be the age 50 to age 64 period that I'm focusing on. Okay. Just to give you a little bit more context about what are the preferences in this setting. So the household is going to be receiving utility from consumption, leisure of both of the spouses, and kind of caregiving utility. Now, husband's disability status, I measure it into kind of 3 discrete states. So 0, 1, 2, healthy, moderate, and severe disability. And also what I'm allowing for here is that there's going to be some health dependence in your utility. So you can see that in the first term, there's a theta S term multiplied in front of the consumption utility. So this is kind of my way of allowing for the fact that there may be health state dependence in consumption utility. So we can think that, when a household is in a disabled state, your marginal utility of consumption is maybe higher than compared to the healthy state, because maybe you have to spend more money on medical services, maybe you need to buy more equipment, maybe you need taxi service or transportation service. That could be one direction. Other people have argued that it could be going the other way. We could have negative health state dependence, because when you are disabled or unhealthy, you are less likely to, let's say, go on vacation or enjoy entertainment and such. Now, but the theta S is actually going to be quite important when we're making welfare analysis, and the reason being is that when we think about the role of insurance, what we're trying to do is that we're trying to transfer resources from the good state to the bad state, such that your consumption is smooth across all states. Now, if for some reason your marginal utility of consumption is different in different states, you can see that that's going to be directly affecting how much resources we should be transferring from the healthy state to the disabled state. And because of this, there has been a lot of debate about the direction of this parameter, but there still is not a lot of consensus. But what I'm doing is that I am kind of tying my event study patterns that I've showed you to back out this parameter and then see how that affects our welfare analysis. Okay, so I'm kind of getting short on time, so I'll be quickly moving. To estimate the parameters, I'm using a simulated method of moments. And one of the kind of key moments that I am using is basically the event study pattern that I have just shown you in the first part of the model. So the event study patterns that I've showed you are going to be not only just motivational, but also going to be key moments that I use in order to estimate the kind of key parameters in this model. Now, to just give you a kind of brief intuition about how the spousal labor supply responses across health states and wives' caregiving choices can help us infer this parameter, is that if we just think about Okay, if we just think about how spouses change their labor supply across health states, within each state, the wife is going to choose market hours such that it reveals how valuable consumption is. So if we see the change in the spousal labor supply responses across health states, that's going to tell us a bit, or that is going to be indicative of how strong health state or the direction of the health state dependence. Now, this is going to be fine for income shocks in which are not induced by health shocks. But what I'm going to be showing you guys is that actually matching both caregiving choices is very important, because the wife's caregiving choices is also going to affect her decisions for spousal labor supply responses across these health states. All right, so I think this table might be slightly more helpful. So what I'm showing you here is that this is the baseline kind of estimates. Of course, I have a lot more parameters, but to give you kind of key parameters here, the baseline estimate shows that there's positive health dependence. So when you're moderately disabled, households are going to value consumption 8% more, and then when you're severely disabled, about 18% more. Now, in the no caregiving model, you can see that this is vastly underestimated, and then it's actually saying that there's negative health state dependence. So in the no caregiving model, where we do not consider the fact that wives are spending time in caregiving versus leisure and market hours, theta 2 actually turns out to be 0.9, right? And then it looks like I am almost done with time, so I'm just going to show you the key counterfactual here.
Yes, please, you should be wrapping up. Okay,
yes, I'll just talk about this one and then we're going to be ending. So let's just look at the first row over here. So the first row here in the baseline model says that for each dollar of SSDI benefits, households are going to be valuing this as about 97 cents. So this is still slightly less than the cost, but it is close enough. Now in the no caregiving model, this is going to be dropping to 91 cents. And then the reason is because in the no caregiving model, they because in the baseline, in the baseline, the married households, spousal labor supply responses are reduced due to caregiving, so that is actually pushing up some of the welfare value relative to cost. Now, it's unfortunate that I have to stop at this point, but why don't we just quickly summarize. So kind of the key takeaway that you should take here is that spousal labor supply responses seem to be very mitigated or attenuated due to these caregiving needs. And then that's going to be pushing the insurance value of SSDI up relative to its cost, right? So apologies for kind of the time overlap, and then I think I should be ending here.
Okay. Thank you, Siha. So there is a question here from Matias Cortez. What he's asking is, do you control for husband-wife characteristics in the event of study analysis? Because the type of households being hit by a layoff are likely quite different from the ones that are hit by disability shocks. So, and whether this could drive the different response.
Sorry, Anna, the audio is not good. Would you mind repeating the question once more? I apologize.
Here, I don't mind jumping in.
Hello?
Hi, Anna, you're a little choppy. Maybe we're not able to hear you. But I'm happy to ask the question on your behalf if that's okay with you. Okay, so the question, Siha, was, do you control for husband-wife characteristics in the event study analysis? The types of households being hit by layoff shocks are likely different from the ones being hit by disability shocks. Can this be driving the differential response? And thanks, Matthias, for that question.
Oh,
Right. There are some controls that I am using. So, for example, husband's and wife's age. I'm also controlling for kind of a region, household size, and also length of the current marriage to kind of control for a proxy of the quality of the marriage. I think I also try various other controls, such as household wealth. And that didn't really make a big difference for my results.
Okay, Siha, so the next question is from Tammy. She says, when I've looked at younger spouses, I've noticed that the added worker effects appear to diminish in more recent cohorts. Have you tried to account for cohort differences here?
Oh, so I don't think I have looked at cohorts. So my analysis here is basically just pooled. I am looking at husbands of ages 50 and 64. So I'm not sure if my screen is showing, but the added worker effect in my result is also kind of diminishing as well. I'm guessing that the slide is not showing here, but it does diminish slightly. So I think in that sense, maybe it is consistent with what Tammy is looking at, but it is true that I have not looked at it by different cohorts here.
Okay. So the next question is from Mikhail. He asks, it looks like wives anticipate husbands' layoff and disability shocks at least 2 years in advance. Is that correct? And what explains this?
So that is correct. So here, the graph, because it's biennial, I am pooling it by 2 years. So when you see the graph in my slides, when you see 4 years before, that is actually including 4 years and 3 years before. For 2 years before, that is actually including 2 years and 1 year 1 year before. And what I found is that a lot of the the pre-trend that we are seeing 2 years before is driven by year -1. So it seems that there does seem to be some expectation of layoffs 1 year before it actually happens. So that is what I see. And then actually, I think there's another paper, I think it's a 2002 paper by Steffens, who is looking at something similar to this, but using a different data set for using the PSID. And I believe that's what he also found as well, that there does seem to be some expectation or, positive added worker effects that he picks up 1 or 2 years before the layoff actually happens.
Okay, thank you, Sia. Anna is chatting to me in the text, so I'm sort of the voice of Anna in your ears. So we're gonna stop questions for now. Of course, thank you for asking your questions, and see how we'll get them all after the talk. So if there's anything else for her, please put it in the Q&A box. We're gonna move on to our next speaker, who is Neil Lloyd from University of British Columbia. Are you, there we go, perfect.
Okay, thank you very much. A quick thank you to Anna and Grant for putting this webinar together. And thank you for this opportunity to speak about this paper titled Strategic Self-Employment and Family Formation. Just want a quick caveat that there's a couple of results I would have liked to have shared with you guys that I unfortunately was not able to extract from the RDC before we all got shut down. So please bear with me in that regard. So the research question behind this paper is quite simply, what is the self-employment response to family formation? So we know that childbirth induces a large long-run adjustment to female labor market outcomes, in particular at the extensive margin. This then shifts the relative earnings of married couples, and an individual tax structure may incentivize some kind of income shifting between individuals in their households. For this reason, households may benefit from being self-employed after childbirth beyond other non-pecuniary benefits such as childcare externalities. We could then expect some kind of coordinated selection into self-employment, even possibly before childbirth. So why does this matter? Well, it matters because childbirth could be associated with a long-lasting selection into self-employment, which potentially increases the risk exposed to that households are exposed to, because self-employed households are typically uninsured and have a higher income variance. It also could be important because it suggests that selection to self-employment at least is a joint and not an individual choice, and this kind of complicates the question of asking what motivates male versus female self-employment. And it also suggests that there might be a sensitivity to policy changes along dimensions that are typically overlooked, this kind of inframarginal difference between relative tax rates in the household, and also an increase in a more elastic sector of the labor market. So this paper relates to a number of areas of the literature. Obviously, it relates to this question of the parent penalty and how households respond to the event of childbirth and how childbirth affects households in the long run. This literature has emphasized the large extensive margin response on the female side, but typically doesn't show an extensive margin response on the male side and shows some kind of heterogeneous intensive margin responses. I'm going to argue that self-employment is a very interesting inframarginal area of response that spouses, in particular male spouses, adjust their labor supply on. Then it relates to this question of self-employment and gender differences in the self-employed labor market. This literature has largely emphasized the difference between flexibility as profit, emphasized the difference between flexibility versus profit as a rationale for why you see such differences across genders in self-employed outcomes. I'm going to argue in this paper that that kind of individual level analysis is complicated when you think that maybe households are selecting the self-employment in a very coordinated and joint manner. Finally, next it relates to the literature obviously on the breadwinner hypothesis and the question of relative earnings, which has found that that drop in the relative earning distribution at 50-50 is correlated with gender norms. A recent study, as I show in this paper, has also highlighted the fact that this drop is really explained by self-employed or co-employed households, and therefore we should really be thinking about the relationship between self-employment or co-employment and gender norms and what's driving the regional variation in those patterns. Finally, we know from this kind of public policy literature that the self-employed are more responsive, and this is kind of adding an additional discussion to that large body of literature and how the self-employed might adjust to different tax incentives, how they bunch at tax kinks. And I'm going to argue that the area on the margin of income splitting, you do see a large adjustment both on the male and the female side. So what do I do in this paper? Well, I'm going to begin by sharing with you an event study design analysis of selection into self-employment around initial childbirth, similar to the one that's provided in the papers by CLEF and co-authors in 2019. It shows that maternal increase in self-employment is around 2 percentage points, or around half the life cycle increase in female self-employment. But paternal self-employment increases around 4%, and this is really a switching between the wage-paying sector and the self-employed sector that seems to be associated with the event of childbirth. I'm going to show that the maternal selection into self-employment is really a selection into co-employment, and this is supported by matching on industry. I'm going to suggest that there's some immediate tax savings that these households benefit from because of their difference in their relative income distribution. And I won't be able to show you today, unfortunately, but in the future, hopefully, I will get to show you this, that the real labor supply response on the intensive margin of the mother is possibly delayed slightly. So there's immediate tax benefit, but then there's a real labor supply response. This lags by about 3 to 4 years. I'm then going to provide a simulated instrument research design to suggest that this increase in selection into self-employment around the event of childbirth is associated with tax incentives. And this is going to argue, I'm going to argue here that really what we should be thinking about is income splitting as a subsidization for male and self-employment and co-employment even before childbirth. Right, and then I'm going to show you some patterns in the regional variation in the selection into co-employment around childbirth, and suggest that maybe the gender norms hypothesis that suggests that breadwinner hypothesis is associated with gender norms across regions could really be also traced down to differences in the tax structure that really incentivize additional levels of self-employment across the regions in Canada. So the data that's going to be the basis for this study is the longitudinal administrative data set. Fortunately, I don't have too much time to go into what I do, but there's a couple of steps I take to try to identify self-employed households and measure households. I do benchmark this against the SLID and the CIS, as well as the labor force survey, and my measure does track the trends that you see in these surveys. Also, I complement this with the analysis of the SLID and the CIS survey, because the SLID and CIS has this nice complementarity of having both the tax data as well as the reported labor supply variables that kind of give you that idea of how the two measures relate to one another. And then finally, I do use the labor force survey as a benchmark and as well as a way to benchmark against the US. So to begin, let's start with the event study design of initial childbirth. So this is a rather straightforward methodology that's been popularized by Cleveland and co-authors, the event study design of initial childbirth. It's, in this case, is going to be a linear probability model, so there's discrete outcome with event time dummies, the alphas, and then also dummies for age, as well as dummies for year, for the year. What you then do is you then take the coefficient on the event time dummies and you normalize by the expected value of the outcome under the counterfactual that the event did not take place. Now, the normalization I'm going to use is the expected level of employment, not the expected level of self-employment or wage employment, just total employment, such that the denominator is the same whether you're looking at self-employment responses or wage employment responses. So that's just to emphasize. And this can be done using the longitudinal administrative data set from 1990 through to 2016, or births from 1992 onwards. So you see them at least 2 years before initial childbirth. So we see that maternal participation in self-employment actually increases in contrast to the sharp decline in maternal participation in wage employment. This is around half the life cycle increase in female self-employment. And initially, this is kind of consistent with the kind of flexible labor market hypothesis that women select into more flexible forms of employment or flexible occupations with childbirth. But when you look at the paternal side, what you actually see is a very clear pattern of switching between wage and self-employment that actually begins around 3 years before childbirth. The trend is flat around 3 years before childbirth, but then starts to increase even before childbirth, suggesting that we can't really think about this event of childbirth as a kind of exogenous shock. I'm not going to argue that point here, that this is kind of causal. Sorry. If you then, this kind of question then of, well, the female selection to self-employment, is this being driven by male selection to self-employment? So if you look at the difference in the self-employment decision of women who are married to wage and self-employed men, what you see is really the spouses of self-employed men who sharply increase their self-employment immediately after childbirth. And this is a kind of a long-lasting effect. So this suggests that this is really a co-employment response. It could be that this is just inspired business or entrepreneurial activity. So I started a business, my spouse then starts a business after childbirth. But when you look at kind of data on industry matching, you see that over the life cycle, there's a large increase in industry matching in self-employed households. In fact, over the life cycle, industry matching in couples in Canada increases from 16% to 20%, so it's a 4 percentage points increase, and 2-earner households. And that industry matching increase is explained entirely by self-employed households. In fact, it's very flat, the age profile of industry matching and wage-employed households. This suggests that there's a concentration of risk because you're exposed to the same industry or sector, and also you're in a sector that is uninsured. And we know from the COVID-19, there's been huge questions about the risk that self-employed households are exposed to because of this lack of insurance. And here you have this issue of concentration in the same industries, which highlights the importance of this topic in the light of the COVID-19 event. So why would you want to be co-employed? Well, one of the benefits of being co-employed is that you have this ability to potentially split your income. And that is that you can have a more equal income distribution. And we see that when you look at the income distributions across wage and self-employed households, that jump that you see around the 50-50 mark is really explained by the self-employed households who concentrate their relative incomes around 50-50, and this yields tax benefits in the immediate and long run. So the next slide I would have liked to have shown you in event time, but unfortunately I was not able to do, is just kind of how the average tax rate of these self-employed households declines in event time relative to initial childbirth. It's quite a dramatic and sharp drop-off, and it's has a long-run and persistent effect. So these households definitely benefit in the medium term, and this kind of decline in the relative tax rate of self-employed households is not really explained by a decline in relative earnings over the life cycle either. So what I do in the paper then is I try to link this kind of very strategic, what appears to be a very strategic selection into self-employment, in particular when we think about the spouses who are preempting the event of initial childbirth by selecting into self-employment. Try to link the strategic behavior to tax incentives that might induce such coordinated responses. So income splitting. This is basically what is the difference in your tax rate or your after-tax income if you were to file as a joint tax household, where you pay 2 times the taxes of the average income in the household, or you file as individual household. We know there's a large literature in Canada to suggest that self-employed households do this, so it's not novel to suggest that this is happening in Canada. What I use here is a measure, a simple measure of delta, which is the relative change in after-tax income households under an individual and joint tax structure. When you think about delta and the way it changes relative to, let's say, a base period before childbirth, there's going to be 2 important components to that change. First of all, childbirth is typically associated with this asymmetric shock to labor supply and income, which then changes the relative income of these households. And that means that you're going to get a potentially increase in delta just from the changes in income relative to base period before childbirth. So there's a childbirth component to it. But then there's also a tax structure component to it, and that is that relative to a base period before childbirth, the tax structure may have changed, which may then change the value of income splitting. And what I'm going to try to do is extract the variation in the tax structure component relative to the base period of childbirth and use that to identify how households respond to these tax incentives relative to the period before childbirth. So I'm going to have a fairly simple reduced form model. We're going to look at the discrete outcome of self-employment, and I'm going to look at its elasticity relative to these proportional tax savings, conditional controls. You can do this by event time, or I can do this in an interactive model with event time dummies. So I'm already looking at those responses in self-employment relative to a base period before childbirth. The first challenge is that in order to know delta, you need to know the true level of incomes in the household, and those you don't actually observe because all I observe is the kind of filed incomes in the kind of the LAD data set. And so I don't actually know what the pre-manipulation incomes are. And so I use a predicted path of income. Also, the level of income is endogenous to whatever labor supply decisions are being made, and that's not the variation, the endogenous variation I'm trying to exploit. The second issue is that even if you have a predicted path of income, which the level of delta may be partially endogenous to the household before childbirth, because they can predict out how the value of income splitting might change as they experience the shock of childbirth, and they could predict out the increased benefit it might have. And so they could know this value of delta even before the event of childbirth. So what I use is a counterfactual level of delta, which is the value of delta had the tax structure stayed exactly the same as a level before the event in the base period. So imagine that a household is thinking about planning for the event of childbirth. You're potentially thinking about selecting into self-employment. You know what the tax structure looks today. You predict out a path of delta that you then use to kind of plan these decisions you make. And then the tax structure is realized in the next period, and the tax structure is different to the value that you had. Obviously, it's going to be different in a way that depends on both of the incomes in the household. So it's the variation in the realized value of delta for this predicted path of income, conditional on the counterfactual that I'm going to try to exploit in this to identify these elasticities. There's a quick example. Here you have a simulated value of delta for the realized value and the counterfactual value for a household in Ontario with a relative income split of 40-60 and for different total income values for the household. We see that the household here through event time, the households that had an income of around 100,000 have the biggest change in the realization of the value of delta relative to the counterfactual. And this kind of response here is coming from the federal tax reform in 2000 that really changed that middle bracket and therefore lowered the value of income splitting for households in this kind of income bracket. So each of these tax changes, whether at the federal or provincial level, is driving a response in the value of income splitting dependent on the level of the households of each individual's income in the household. I'm going to skip quickly through the other identifying assumptions I need to make. There are quite a few, so I'm going to skip through them. But to move on to quickly, what is the hypothesis? Well, we're thinking here about strategic self-employment, and that is that there's a kind of coordinated response resulting in co-employment or joint self-employment. So that means we're really thinking that these responses to these tax incentives should at some point be symmetric or equal. So beta J1, so the beta from event time J is equal across men and women. Right. Another way to think about this is you could just kind of, because we're testing this hypothesis that these betas are equal, you could think about this as the null hypothesis that the ratio of them is equal to 1. And that means that there's a kind of a test of the mechanism that can be reframed in terms of the IV estimator. And now this is not a traditional instrumental variable approach because this policy shock is something that we're expecting is going to be, it doesn't fulfill the exclusionary restriction, but the IV estimator gives you the test for the fact that the two coefficients are equal to one another, at least at some point after childbirth, right? So they may not be equal to another before childbirth, but at some point after childbirth, there should be an equal response. So this is showing on the paternal side or the quote first stage side. On the paternal side, what these elasticities look like. Before the base period -2, you see that the elasticity is 0, and that's kind of a test for the placebo effect, given that you're using the identifying variation based on a counterfactual that had not realized before event time -2. You see that the elasticity that you estimate for the men is around 0.5, and it's very stable and is equal to around 0.5, 0.6 even before childbirth. On the maternal side, you see that the elasticity is actively 0 before the event of childbirth, but then increases monotonically to around that same level, around 0.5, 0.6, and meaning that the IV estimator, which gives us a test for the mechanism, is you cannot reject 1 from event time 3 all through to 6. And this you can estimate, I can estimate this in the full model. Here, I'll skip that for now. You can see that this is robust to inclusion of various controls. You still get this kind of IV estimate of 0.1 through periods, event time 3 to period 6. So then there's the question of the regional variation in co-employment. So the question here is, given that we know that co-employment really explains this income bunching, is co-employment response really a cultural response, or is it about tax incentives? This is a bit of an open-ended question still. So what you see is that the regional pattern in maternal selection and self-employment, conditional and spousal self-employment, rarely follows as the stark, there's quite a lot of regional variation, I should say, and it follows the pattern of what we know about the cultural or gender norms in Canada. You have the largest response in Alberta, also see a large response in the rest of the prairies, and then a high response in Ontario and British Columbia, and very little response in Quebec. On the paternal side, you see the same large response on the paternal, same large switching on the paternal side in Alberta, in Ontario, in Quebec. And this is kind of consistent with, as I was saying, with what we know about the gender norms. So in terms of the mechanism driving the bunching and the relative income distribution and gender norms, this kind of is consistent with that pattern. But I would argue that what we should really be thinking about is what explains the regional differences in self-employment amongst men across Canada. So in Ontario, that's around 18%, but there's quite a lot of regional variation in the self-employment of men in Canada. Obviously, a lot of this is to do with industry and occupation. If you condition on those variables, industry, occupation, education, age, and the monthly unemployment rate to account for any kind of business cycle effects, you still see that there's persistent regional variation in the level of male self-employment across Canada. What I'm going to do then is just try to think that if you take these regional dummies relative to Ontario and you map them to a simulated value of the relative change in after-tax income from splitting of, let's say, $80,000 in real dollars, and then normalize that to Ontario as well, you see that this pattern in terms of the increased regional variation this pattern of the regional variation in self-employment is highly correlated with the tax structure pattern that you see in terms of the value of income splitting. And in fact, that line that you estimate between the different regional dummies weighted by the variance of each regional dummy variable that's estimated is around 0.5, 0.6, which is close to those elasticities that I estimate. So to conclude, in Canada, childbirth is associated with an increase in co-employment. This is around 2 percentage points, or half of the life cycle increase in co-employment is associated with the event of childbirth. Family formation is therefore a very important inducement of parental self-employment. And it's not just a maternal side, but it's a paternal side as well. And I think that's an important contribution of this paper. I link these to strategic adjustments to the individual tax structure using a simulated instrument identification strategy. And this gives me an explicit test of the mechanism using the kind of IBS meta, even though it's not a traditional instrumental variable approach. An estimated elasticity around 0.5. This elasticity is large enough to explain the difference in male self-employment between the US and Canada, which is around 1 to 1.5 percentage points, if we think about what are the simulated or expected savings from income splitting. This suggests that tax savings increase or subsidize male self-employment even before childbirth and also co-employment. And also some suggested evidence that the regional differences in male self-employment are correlated with tax structure components and not necessarily just cultural norms. Thank you very much.
Okay, so
Thank you for a very nice presentation. Oh, sorry, can you hear me or?
Yes,
yes.
can. Go ahead. That's much better.
Okay. So we have some questions from the audience. I don't know if we will cover them all, but at least I had one question on my own. I was curious to know how your model accounts for the fact that not all prospective parents can actually switch to self-employment. So there is that issue in terms of how you account for the switch to self-employment. Have you done anything about this? Or?
So I think what you're describing is that not all industries or occupations have an obvious path into self-employment. And this is certainly the case if you look at self-employment rates across industry and occupation. Unfortunately, I don't have the data in the LAD to kind of look at industry. It's only available from 2000 onwards. And the event study design uses the kind of the full period, and the tax variation, a lot of it is coming from differences in the 90s relative to the 2000s. And so I don't have the industry in which to do that. But I could try to do something using the labor force survey and just to provide some suggestive evidence.
Yeah, that would be really nice. There is another question from Mikal, who wonders about the policy relevance of your study.
Yeah. So I think from a policy
particularly in the context of the COVID-19.
Yeah. So in the context of COVID, I think that we've hit on this fact that there are a large share, or in Canada at least, there's a disproportionately large share of households that are self-employed, and which means that they don't typically pay for employment insurance. That has changed in the sense that it's now optional. When you look at the selection into who's paying EI, it's typically women around childbearing years. And so it means that it's important in terms of we're thinking about the insured nature of households. It's also important thinking about, from a policy relevance perspective, in terms of thinking about the concentration of risk from the industry matching perspective. This suggests that there's a large increase in households that are employed within the same business. That means in the same industry. So if you have an industry-specific shock, like COVID-19, you have a double incidence on a household where there are two individuals employed in the same business.
Thank you. There is also a question regarding whether or not you continue to look into the effect on self-employment when there is a second child. So are you able to look at this, or? Yeah,
I should be able to do this. It is something that's on my list of things to do. I think that list has changed with the limit of how much time I'm going to have in the RDC, but it's certainly something I'm going to look into. What you do see is there's this kind of staggered increase in maternal self-employment after childbirth, and that's certainly consistent with what you see in the SLID, in the sense that you see almost like a second child response, a greater second child response. And I think what's happening is that there are EI incentives to re-enter the wage-paying sector. So if you plan to have 2 children, you may want to delay the decision to be co-employed until the second child to benefit from the EI income. And so you go back into your wage-paying job, but then with the second child, it really seems to be that the long-lasting effect kicks in. And so this speaks to kind of the timing of this co-employment response. And it certainly seems that the co-employment response might really kick in its full extent with the second child. And that you start to see a real labor supply response in terms of hours worked. Also in terms of increased working from home, you start to see with the second child relative to the first child. And so I think what I wasn't able to speak to today, but hopefully in the future I'll be able to speak to, is that there seems to be almost a kind of immediate tax benefit with the first child, but then there's a kind of a delayed real labor supply response. You do see an increase in the value added from female labor supply in these households. And so it creates almost like a bubble between the first and second child where there's this tax benefit. And because of that bubble, if you are thinking about this path as a household, you really, the father really wants to start the business before the event of the first child in order to benefit from that bubble or tax window of tax savings.
Okay, that's very interesting. And actually, a last question, maybe. So Kevin Devereaux asks whether, do you think there are economies of scale in putting both members of the household into a shared self-employment enterprise, or is maybe a consumption value of working together?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's more of a consumption value, and I think to a large extent it's got to do with spillovers into the kind of childcare domain. And so what you seem to see is that there is a value added, but it's probably not going to replace the wage-paying job that was lost. Once the women start to increase their labor supply in these businesses, I think what's the reason for that is that you do see in kind of time use data, you see an increased childcare hours, as well as this is consistent with the fact that you see increasing working from home for the mothers who are in these households through the event of childbirth. And so there's definitely seems to be more a kind of a spillover or externality into the child production domain, which is consistent with the literature. And I think what's interesting here is that that's something that the literature has highlighted, but in some ways you can't really think about that as an individual decision on the female self-employment side. It should really be thought about as a joint. So there's a kind of a bargaining of the household production and the business production that's going on.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a comment, I don't know if it's a comment or a question, from Stephanie Lewis, actually saying that self-employed workers could only collect employment insurance benefits since 2011, and yes, whether or not you have noticed a difference because of this.
Yeah, I have not noticed a difference in terms of the kind of event study design analysis. One thing that has changed, and I was running these numbers recently, is the residual gender gap in self-employment has declined since 2011. It's not clear why that is, if that is because of this, suggesting that the residual gender gap, once you condition on age, education, and other factors, is, if that's explained, like with the wage gap, if it's explained by the childbirth and anything related to childbirth, then the decline in that could suggest that the introduction of this elective EI has contributed to that. However, you would think then that you could look at the difference between Quebec and the rest of Canada, because Quebec has ensured self-employment in terms of maternal EI since 2006, and you don't really see a difference there. This seems to be consistent across Canada. The residual gap has been declining since 2011. So yeah, it's unclear how that policy has changed things, but it certainly is that selection into who is paying EI seems to largely be concentrated amongst women in those kind of child-rearing years.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. So I encourage you to keep submitting your questions if you have any remaining questions, and that will be forwarded to the speaker so that they can answer you over email or in some other way. I just want to close now thanking everybody on behalf of CLEF for this terrific opportunity to be able to deliver the workshop to you. And a special thanks to Grant and Chloe and the CRDCN that has made this possible. I also want to encourage you to attend tomorrow's Parvis Distinguished Lecture. And Kate will be talking about health outcomes of men as the receiver of the Parvis Prize, and it will be a terrific event for everybody. So on behalf of CLEF, just thanks everybody for being here.